Shut up and sit down.
Welcome back to another episode of the Bowhunter Chronicles podcast. Today we're doing another episode in our tactical series with Scott Shawl talking about cedar swamps. So if you've ever been in a large swamp in a remote area, it can be one of the most intimidating experiences, especially after it gets dark. Everything looks the same. Generally, there's not a lot of ambient light, and you can't see very far, even in the daylight. So I wanted to talk to Scott. Scott's family has a history of hunting these big cedar swamps since back in the 1800s, and they've made a point of going in there, killing big deer, patterning, figuring out, navigating these swamps. And it's just something that's intrigued me because it's something that is, much like killing big bucks, that's intriguing, but along with that, it's intimidating. So to talk to somebody who's kind of quote unquote figured these swamps out is just definitely someone that I wanted to talk to and kind of pick his brain. And I think that there's a lot of good information in here, for you guys. And I definitely got a lot out of it, and I hope you do too. And so I hope you enjoy the episode. If you like what we're doing, follow along with us on Instagram, Facebook. Please, just click that little review button, click that 5-star review. That helps us to go up in whatever the algorithm that they have through iTunes or whatever it is that you're listening to this on. And then if you really like what we're doing and you really appreciate this, you can certainly, write us a review. Tell us what you like, what you don't like. Those things are invaluable to us because it's something that we can help. That'll help us create better content going forward. And then, as always, I got to do another shout out to one of our new Patreons, Kyle Gensler. Kyle is currently trying to take my world's worst bow hunter spot. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit later, but he sent multiple arrows at the same deer this year with no connection. So good job on stealthiness and being in the right spot at the right time. Maybe we need to work a little bit on accuracy and things like that, but that's awesome. And our Patreon, that helps us continue to do fun things, giveaways, and things like that. Through the last quarter, we're going to be giving away a saddle. So we're going to be giving away a full saddle hunting setup. I've taken that on this year to be able to talk intelligently or semi-intelligently about it and about my experiences. And it's piqued a lot of people's interest. And so to give back to the listeners, the people that support us, we're going to be doing a giveaway for a saddle setup, be it through Tethered or Trophy Line, whichever is going to be available at that time. So we're going to be doing that. If you want to learn more about that, you can follow us along on our website, which is www.bowhunterchroniclespodcast.com. And if you want to follow along with the Patreon, you want to support the show, you like what we're doing, and you like to figure out a way to contribute and give back, you can certainly do that at patreon.com/Bowhunter Chronicles podcast. And if not, no problem. That's not what we're doing this for. Just go ahead and tell a friend, please. Tell them about the podcast. Tell them about an episode that you really like. Tell them about something that you didn't like. Say, man, you got to listen to these guys. These guys are idiots. Like, listen to this. You can't even believe it. You're such a better hunter than they are. Anything. Just let other people know that we're out here doing this, sharing our story. And, we appreciate every single one of the listeners. And like I said, this was a great podcast for me because it really hits home with what, I'm used to hunting our property in the UP. And, if you drive by these big swamps, you always think, how can I hunt that? Where are the deer going to be? Man, it's so big. Scott does a great job of breaking down kind of how he hunts these and, the best way not to get lost and what happens if you do. Great information in here. Enjoy the episode. Thank you so much for following along. Hey everybody, Adam back with another episode of the Bowhunter Chronicles podcast. Today we have Scott Shawl on to continue our tactics series to talk about big woods, swamps, and kind of some of the most intimidating terrain that I can think of. And this is a guy that's been doing it his whole life. For generations, his family's been doing it. And I couldn't think of a better guy to bring on to talk to give a little bit of insight on how to break down these big, intimidating swamps. So how are you doing tonight, Scott?
Doing very well, on yourself?
I'm doing good. It's our Christmas time. It's hunting season, so it's
just, that's right.
As the year goes on and we get the cooler temperatures, and with this cold snap right now, it's starting to really feel like hunting season, and it's gonna start to get good.
So, yeah, it is. This is my favorite time of the year.
When you wake up and you have that cold feeling, and then to me, there's two things. It's the coolness of the morning, but then when you get about 8, 9, 10 o'clock and the sun comes up, there's that smell of the woods, the fall smell.
Right.
That to me is the visceral part of this time of year. That's what really gets my blood up.
Yeah, it's really an exciting time of the year, and just like you described, we come across those things. Those of us that like to hunt so much. I know that for me personally, it really gets me excited when these temperature changes take place, and we've got some leaf drop going on, and like I said before, it's just my favorite time of the year.
So for our listeners, maybe you haven't poked around on the Hunting Beast forum or seen you on any of the Facebook stuff, can you give a little bit of background on kind of who you are and why we're talking tonight?
Sure. Yep. Name's Scott Shawl, and I've been, as you already mentioned, deer hunting here in Michigan pretty much my entire life. I hunt the northern Lower Peninsula a lot, the Upper Peninsula, and also Ontario, Canada are the places that I most commonly frequent. And the habitat that I prefer and that I've spent more time in than any other type is cedar swamps. So I started off hunting real young, and I was one of the lucky guys. They had a lot of friends and family that were very accomplished hunters. And so early in my hunting career, I was able to lean on them quite a bit. And I've hunted public land pretty much from the start. When I was 12 years old and could first bow hunt, I was on public land that year. Also hunted some private, but I've been on primarily public land my entire hunting career here in Michigan and elsewhere. And again, the cedar swamps are the habitat that my family has hunted more than anything else. So we've been hunting Michigan public land pre-Civil War. We've got documented. So we've spent a lot of time on public land and kind of know a lot about cedar swamps. And the cedar swamps are, to me, kind of like a gated community for the deer. Once they're in there, they're really, really tough to get out. And as you've mentioned, it's a very intimidating habitat. So that's kind of my background. Been hunting since age 12.
And so one of the things I always like to ask people, because I think it's relevant, especially to the audience, whether it's a new hunter or an adult onset hunter, or maybe somebody who's switching from private land to public land, or from rifle hunting to archery, or something like that. With the amount of hunting that your family had done previously, how were you brought up hunting as far as the culture? Was it, did your family shoot does? Were they only shooting large bucks? Was it instilled in you from day one to, target a certain age class of deer? How did that all come about?
Yeah, no, we've shot does, we've shot young bucks, we've shot older bucks. It was never encouraged to hunt any specific size. When I'd see the big buck mounts of my friends and family, some of them were very large. It kind of became a goal to get to that older age class of deer. But the culture back then, there was no pressure on size of buck or anything like that. when I first started hunting, my primary goal back then was we had a large hunting camp for the gun deer season where all the relatives and friends would come together. And so that was something that I really, really wanted to be a part of, and started at age 14, which was the first year that I could legally gun hunt. But no, I had no real encouragement to shoot one size of a buck over another. But seeing the success of my friends and family, those big bucks were definitely what I wanted to get. But I've shot small bucks and medium-sized bucks and some bigger bucks. And so it was a great culture. It was very exciting. The bow hunting part of it that I did was kind of more on my own. Back then, I didn't have a lot of bow hunting friends and family. So it all kind of came together, and as the years went by and I became more skilled, I started moving towards the more advanced age class of bucks. But here in Michigan, there's a lot of areas where a 2.5-year-old buck is a great buck, and I've certainly taken my share of those as well.
Well, I think that's important to say, because, like I said, when with social media and everything, all this information gets disseminated so quickly these days. Everybody thinks that they have to start off on a certain level, or there's, and I mean, there are some extremely successful adult onset hunters because they go into it with a mindset of, they're a sponge. They take up all this information, they pick and choose, and they're at a different point in their life where, I think as a child, 12 years old and even earlier today, but I think when, my generation and your generation were coming up hunting, from 12 years old to 14 years old, you just kind of followed the leader, and there wasn't, and that leader didn't exist on a phone, or maybe even not in a magazine. It was the people that you surrounded yourselves with. And so it changes, things have changed dramatically. So I think these newer generations of hunters are kind of getting shortchanged of that experience of growing and learning and certainly messing up. So,
yeah, that's a great point. There was no social media when I was a beginning hunter, and once in a while, you might see a Field and Stream magazine or an Outdoor Life, but you really kind of had to learn on your own and rely on the experience of others, and also from firsthand hunting, witnessing your mistakes and making adjustments and getting better and better at it. But I agree with you. Now when hunters first get into it, there's so much information available. It's almost a little bit overwhelming for a lot of new hunters. And then the expectations are so high because they see all these big bucks on social media and think that, they should be able to do the exact same thing and just walk out there and get some really big bucks. But, there's a real learning curve with hunting, just like there is with everything else. But that's a great point that you made. And I really think it leads to these high expectations, and in some ways sets new hunters up for failure.
Oh, 100%. I mean, and that's, like we talked about a little bit before, I mean, that's kind of why we're doing this whole thing is, we're extremely happy, blessed hunters to be able to go out and do what we do and, kind of routinely harvest any deer, let alone, good age class deer here or there, us
right.
On this show. And, the fact that it might not be the buck of a lifetime every time, my father-in-law, myself, we get so excited every time, we say time and time again, every harvest with archery equipment is a trophy, no matter
That's
what,
right.
because you've won, and that's kind of like where our expectations are. And as we get older and we grow, you always set your sights on, a more challenge or something, but at the end of the day, sometimes you just want to shoot a deer, and that's
right.
That's perfectly
Exactly.
fine with us.
Yeah, and deer hunting to me and my friends and family, It's a very personal thing. You know, it's we're not worried about what everyone else thinks or what people on social media think we should be doing. You know, we're out there just like you said to enjoy ourselves and to learn. And that's not always going to be a mature buck. You know, we're learning with does, we're learning with young bucks, and I would really encourage people that are new to the sport to try to look at it as being more personal, not worrying so much about what everyone else thinks and what their expectations are, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. But there's got to be a starting point or something like that. So for you, when you started out with your family hunting, and maybe it was that 14-year-old, the first deer camp up there, how did you set out into these big swamps? And at that time, were they just as intimidating to you as they are to myself and probably a lot of the listeners?
Well, when I first started off, my father didn't want me to get lost, so I kind of tagged along a little bit, and so I really wasn't intimidated or fearful because I had him and a close family friend or two to rely on when we penetrated these big cedar swamps, and they've been going into them for many, many decades and even generations. So it really didn't intimidate me nearly as much as when I first started going into new areas of these big cedar swamps all by myself, and that's a whole different story.
And so I had heard you talk on another podcast about the things that they were on those hunts where they were taking you kind of along and you were going with them. And you had said that you just thought that they were taking you along and you didn't realize that they kind of were using some sort of tactical type advantages that you had found out later. So what are some of the ways that they're using the terrain and things like that in these big cedar swamps? I mean, so for a guy that's just, he wants to take myself, for example, and I don't think that it's that unique of a situation. So we have a hunting camp. It's a relatively small camp that's adjacent to a giant cedar swamp. Mm-hmm. And, maybe take somebody through one of those cedar swamps if they're not familiar with it. Because, I mean, when I walk in 100 yards and then I can't see 10 feet, the world gets really small really quickly.
It really does, and you need to be careful if you've never been in one before, and you really do need to know how to navigate. But what we do is we had staggered trails, staggered on purpose in case if someone tried to follow us in the snow and things like that. But we had to make some dead tree log bridges over giant muck areas to get from point A to point B and point E to point F and that sort of a thing. So we always staggered our entry trails going in if it was a spot that we had pre-scouted in the off season. And I think that's a real important thing to do with something like a cedar swamp that's so intimidating. The water and muck can be so deep, is to have some experience with it prior to just blundering in and trying to hunt. But the things that we're looking for are different types of edge or transition. It can be something as small as a creek that you can step across that will have a lot of buck and doe travel and bedding. It could be the edge of a beaver pond. It can be a transition in tree type, and all of those things are where the bucks really prefer to travel and bed. And so that's what we're looking for. We're looking for some islands. And another point about cedar swamps that a lot of people don't understand is you can look at a lot of topos and aerials of cedar swamps and not really see any transitions. Some of the islands that I've hunted for decades, you can't see them on a topo map. They don't show up because the difference in the elevation is so slight, but yet you're going from a very wet swamp that you're walking through and stepping onto a little bit of an island. And if you don't do on the ground, boots on the ground scouting, these islands that I'm speaking of, you can't really see on either an aerial or a topo right now. So, you need to get back there and find these things. And when I'm going into a new area, I'm always looking up at the treetops because typically hardwoods or softwoods on an island are going to have more elevation in the treetops than the surrounding cedar swamp. And again, they're not going to show up on any aerial view or on any topo map. So I would really encourage, if you want to hunt cedar swamps, to do as much off-season scouting as you can to familiarize yourself with the areas. Guys that just go blundering in there sometimes spend the night, and I've rescued a few over the years.
Yeah, I want to get into that probably a little bit later in the podcast of like how to not have to be rescued. But use your word here, blundering around in there. So on a topo, on Onyx, on an aerial map, you're not going to be able to see a lot of these transitions, these little islands, a lot of that. So when you're entering in some of these new areas, where do you start? Because if it all looks the same, how are you choosing where you're going to go blunder around, and maybe take us through, one of the first couple times that you had done that and kind of how it ended up.
Sure. It's a lot of work. I'll preface it with that. But if you're not able to see transitions in cover from an aerial around a topo, you're going into a big area that all kind of looks the same. If you don't have a creek to follow to penetrate in and penetrate out as you're exploring, we literally used to grid search pattern the new area, where we take a compass heading and move back and forth in a direction, and then cross trail it as well, and are actually writing down with pencil and paper in a Ziploc bag so it doesn't get wet, kind of a thing, what we're coming across. And a lot of times we'll actually stumble into some creeks, for example, that aren't on any topo map, or we'll come across one of those little micro islands that's got dry ground but isn't in an aerial view and not on the topo map, and we'll blunder into it with those grid patterns. We wear hip boots typically. Always have at least 2 compasses because electronics can fail, especially if you go for a swim. If you can follow a plot trail on Onyx or with some other device, that's great. But you do need to be prepared to get in and get out outside of that. So again, these nearly impenetrable cedar swamps, I always have 2 compasses with me. But that's how we go about breaking it down. And the more time that you spend in an area over the years, and you're doing the grid pattern scouting, if you will, and making your own maps by hand, you get a better idea of what's in there and where the hot places to hunt are. And a lot depends on the deer population, and a lot depends on the hunting pressure inside, or rather outside of the swamp itself.
So when you're choosing to go into an area, what's making you, how do you choose a property?
Well, the big cedar swamps, the more edge that you can find within them, the more desirable it is, and you tend to have better deer populations when you can find cedar swamps like that. So, when you go back and look at a mile or miles wide view on an aerial, for example, if I see some beaver ponds in there, then I'm going to make a beeline for those beaver ponds, things like that. If I see some age structure change in the trees and you can see it on the aerial when you zoom in and out, then I'll make a beeline for that edge, and that's what I'm looking for. If you're coming in blind and doing the grid pattern, you just have to find an area that's got some good some good sized tracks and droppings out by the road, and that alone will have me go in and penetrate a cedar swamp to try to figure out where that buck is spending most of his daylight hours, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. I mean, I find myself doing it now, because in Michigan and in the lower peninsula, you say that the term that you use is combat hunting, and
Yes.
I think everybody who hunts public land in any of these highly pressured states can totally. I mean, it doesn't take much explanation to figure out what that means. But I find myself looking at these big tracts of land where the access is difficult, and I just kind of look at the center of it and look for, where I think the deer would go. But when you get up into those large tracts of land up in the UP, it's completely different. And
Right.
for myself, we've had our property now for like 4 generations. And, my grandfather used to go in and he used to go and say, there's a ridge back there. And it's not on the map. It doesn't look like it. And you have to go through like 200 or 300 yards of like the most dense, thick cover to find this little undulation. And then it picks up and goes on. And I mean, that's kind of like what you're talking about, where you have to be in there to see it. Now, how are you?
Right.
What kind of sign are you looking for when you go in there? Because I mean, like I say, for myself, I don't have experience going in miles and miles because it's just super intimidating. But you go in and you find a rub line or something like that, but you can only see 20 yards in front of you, maybe, or the terrain, at least for us, isn't necessarily all that wet, but it's really, I don't know, pitted. Like every single one of the cedar trees is like up, and then it goes down into like moss and root systems, and there isn't any high ground whatsoever. And so you're like at eye level with the canopy. And I've tried to hunt in there many times, and you might see some legs go by, or you might see, pick up some movement way off, but the amount that you can see, or a lot of times, unless like you say, you come to some sort of an edge or a pond or something like that, getting in a tree is completely out of the question. Just because of the way that the cedars grow. So what kind of sign, once you get in there, are you looking for? And then how are you setting up on that because of the limitations? Because I think that's what a lot of people will run into as well.
Sure. Should probably preface it with, it really depends a lot on hunting pressure. You've probably got a lot less up on the property that you're describing. But if there's not a lot of hunting pressure, a lot of the bucks will tend to bed out towards the edge of the swamp and not be in all that far. That being said, there are bucks that spend their entire lives in and around those big cedar swamps. I've penetrated a very large cedar swamp in August, 93 degrees, just to satisfy my personal curiosity years ago as to what, if any, deer would be back there and why would they be back there. I was actually shocked when I came across it was a beaver dam, but it wasn't really much of a pond. But when I'm walking on the edge of it, I found mature buck tracks, and this is way back in August. Really, no reason for him to have to be back that far, and yet there he was. So the things that I'm looking for when I get back in there that tells me that I've got things going on are droppings, come across some rubs. I mean, if you're in an area that's going to hold some buck traffic, you should be able to spot some old rubs even with the limited visibility. I think that's what really drives most guys crazy in a cedar swamp is they just can't see more than, like you said, 10, 20 feet. To me, a clearing is, if I can see 25 yards, that's a clearing in these big cedar swamps. So you kind of learn after you spend a lot of time back there how the bucks are going to move through an area. The terrain and the water will kind of push you the same way that the bucks are going to go. If they're not being pressured, they're kind of lazy, and a lot of times you'll move to where those bucks are going to go through the area all on your own. So if I'm finding some oversized droppings, those droppings are left year round and every day. If you actually do get to a dry spot and can pick up some big tracks, when I see these transitions, if I come across a transition, then I'll often be able to find bedding as well. And that's what I'm looking for, is to try to figure out where the bucks are spending most of their time. As bucks mature and get older, they really don't want to have much human contact at all, and there's no better environment for a buck to be in than a big cedar swamp and not be bothered and not smell any human scent, because everyone's afraid to penetrate very far. So I would qualify it with, there was a time that I thought you had to be as far back in the middle of these cedar swamps as you could possibly be, and I spent a lot of time back there, and sometimes you can be very successful. But there's also bucks that are right out on the edge of the cedar swamp, that are very familiar with the area and have lived most of their lives there. And it kind of depends on how much hunting pressure there is, how far into these swamps most of these bucks are going to want to go. But when I go in and scout these swamps, I can see things such as tree size, root structure, and I can kind of tell where the bucks are going to be moving through that area. A lot of times there's some hidden wind currents that follow through an area way back in the middle of these big cedar swamps. And it's kind of like a river, only these are air currents down underneath the almost impenetrable canopy of the cedars, and the bucks will travel using those wind currents. It's actually the same thing with a small creek, even a creek that's only a couple of feet across that penetrates and goes through a big cedar swamp like that. The bucks will follow it, the does will follow it. They'll use it as a highway for bedding, to food coming in and out of the swamp. The bucks will use it to transition between doe areas during the rut. So those are kind of the things that I look for to get me onto the bucks sooner rather than later.
And so you had mentioned to food sources. Are there different food sources inside of those cedar swamps where you're not finding oak trees or, what we would typically think, and there's not maybe ag around, anything like that?
Right. Yeah, no, so the white cedar, which they end up eating most of the winter, they'll typically start eating it in the Upper Peninsula, for example. Late October, they'll start finding it in their stomach contents. And certainly by early November, it's part of their diet. They don't want to eat it, but as other food sources become less available, they'll start eating more and more of it. But other foods that you can find back there, especially around beaver ponds or transition areas, deer eat different kinds of moss and lichens and things like that as well. Sometimes I'll find some red osier dogwood back there on the little micro islands. There might be some maple trees with falling leaves. It just kind of depends on each individual cedar swamp. It's not all cedar trees. There are some other trees that are back there. But the white cedar itself is the only food that a white-tailed deer can eat, in exclusion to all other foods, and survive a hard winter. Throughout the entire rest of the white-tailed range, there is no other food that they can eat in exclusion to everything else and survive. So the white cedar is very important as the primary food source, and it's little understood even by our DNR biologists as to how they actually utilize it in the really mature stands of cedar. A lot of biologists think that the fronds of the cedar, what we would call leaves on other trees, have to be within reach of the deer to be a food source, and that's completely false. So in the really older cedar stands where you've got cedar trees that are over 100 years old, every time the wind blows, there's fronds falling from the white cedars down onto the ground, and the deer can literally just walk around and eat them. So it's not their most preferred food source, but in a worst case scenario, it doesn't really matter what time of the year it is, they can eat white cedar. And if they've got a water source in the winter with your UP winters up there, you get a really hard winter. If they're in one of those cedar stands that's over 100 years old, they've got these fronds falling down every time the wind blows to eat. And if they've got a little spring near their bedding area, they've got water source, and they really don't have to come out and eat other things.
So in that big area, so then there's not, it's not really necessary to key in on a food source or there are going to be travel corridors, but is that why your focus is mainly bedding? Because that's one of the things where they're going to kind of be a little bit more consistent.
Yeah, it's definitely your best bet if you can get close to bedding without disrupting the bucks. You've got a better chance of seeing daytime movement even back in these swamps. That being said, the swamp the size of what you're talking about, they're so impenetrable with so limited visibility as you've described that I find rut activity going on during the daylight in these big cedar swamps, where if you were to just step out on the outside edge of the swamp itself, there's guys hunting everywhere, and that can't happen. And so the deer can take advantage of it, and you can have a lot of all day long running activity back in those cedar swamps that won't take place on the outside. If they do try to move far at all, they're almost shot right away in areas in the lower peninsula anyway. It's not quite as bad as in the upper peninsula. And then in Ontario, the cedar swamps up there, those are true wilderness areas up there and the least pressured of them all.
So take us through like one of your, like a typical hunt when you're going into one of these cedar swamps, as far as like the amount of time that it takes to go in there, how far you're going in, and is it a morning hunt? Are you going all day, evening hunt? Kind of a normal scenario for you.
Okay. Well, in bow season, it's more typically going to be a morning or an evening hunt, or in the hunt for a few hours. In gun season, I was always willing to get a little more carried away. So, for example, if I came up to your Upper Peninsula and I was able to look at aerials and topos of some very large cedar swamps, I would locate an island or two that may be a mile and a half back in, that sort of a thing. Do a quick recon on it. If I confirm there's a mature buck using that island, then I start well before daylight, following compass, GPS. I'm in hip boots, carrying my rifle, and one buck that I took in the UP in a huge cedar swamp. It took me a couple of hours to get on stand because they had to do a big end around to approach the island without any chance of the buck being able to detect me. And so this island in the middle of the cedar swamp had some 10-inch diameter trees that were getting hit, and they were tall rubs, and I knew it was a mature buck based on his tracks and the rubs and his droppings. And when I finally got on stand, as I said, it took me a couple of hours to get there in hip boots. If I had walked straight out to the island, it probably would have only taken me 40, 45 minutes. But, the way the prevailing winds are in that area, every deer on that island would have known I was approaching. So I got there, I set up on a little knoll just off of the island, and this was November 15th, open to gun season, and about 9 a.m., pretty sure it was the big guy approaching, long big deer coming toward the edge of the island over where I determined the buck was going to be bedding. And he picked me off, and he took off and fled. And then at 1:15 p.m. that same day, a different buck came down that island edge, and he dressed out well over 200 pounds. So I was really happy with him. So if you can find these transitions, that's much preferable. If you can look at these big cedar swamps and you can see an interior beaver pond, or where a tornado went through, a blowdown area, anything out of the ordinary, that's really what you want to key in on as far as what I'm looking for up there. And so that was an example of an Upper Peninsula hunt that I was successful on a really nice buck up there inside a cedar swamp.
And one thing about that's really interesting to me, and it's one of the things that it keeps coming up as far as like questions that I have, is twofold. So on that particular hunt, using that as an example, and you're taking that long path out there to go to an area that you scouted and you figured out where it was. One, what happens if you're bumping deer on your way out there? Does that matter at all, or not, because it's not where you're going?
Yeah, it's not my destination. I certainly don't want to bump my target buck if I don't have to. But if I bump other deer, I'm pretty sure that I've got a really good idea of that buck's patterns and where he's moving. I'm not too worried about it. I'm going to continue on and hunt. If I bump some other deer, I just keep going. Yeah, it's not going to stop me. It never has, and I've been very successful by not worrying about that.
Okay, because I think that's where a lot of guys. I mean, I know for a fact that I've done it, and I've bumped deer, and then I'm like, oh, I should, do I need to make a decision? Yeah. Do I need to do this? So to hear that and say, well, it doesn't matter, and then, so what is your mindset when your target buck just busts out of there? Did you make any sort of shift, or did you try to change your location so that you could, kind of make the next step, or did you just you hung tight in the exact same spot and said, well, maybe another buck's going to come and use it, and that's what happened, or how did that? What's the mindset there?
Well, sometimes the bucks will end up later approaching from a different direction, trying to figure out what happened. Sometimes they're not exactly sure, what happened. So I stayed put, didn't move, stayed right where I was, and almost got ran over by the buck that I shot. The little knoll that I was on, I think, was his actual intended bedding area. And then the really big buck was on that island on just this slight elevation on the downwind edge of it. And that's where he preferred to bed when he was using that island. But, there's a lot of rut activity going on in the Upper Peninsula around November 15th as well. So I was hoping that another buck would come through, and in fact, one did.
Okay, and so for our listener, you keep talking about these beaver ponds, and you've got some really great information about bedding and using these ponds and how the deer use them. And actually, I was listening to some of the other podcasts, and I referenced them to my brother, it's not in a cedar swamp, it's just out in around some ag fields, and there's a pond there, and using kind of like your information, I mean, we located the beds like to a T, so it doesn't necessarily have to be in the cedar swamps. But how are you seeing bedding where these bucks are bedding around these ponds in this water area?
Sure. Yeah, the potholes of water in farm country, like we were talking about, those are big buck magnets. I have an acquaintance that kind of made a career out of shooting big bucks in potholes of water in farm areas. But in the big cedar swamps, bucks don't always do something. I wouldn't want to tell you that they always bed on the upwind side of the pond watching downwind or anything like that. They may do it quite often, but not always. And sometimes they'll actually be on the other side of the pond. And there's reasons for it. It might be for protection or so that they can watch their approach trail. The habitat makes a difference on where these bucks bed around these beaver ponds. So, we can speak in generalities, but they're not absolutes. And what I found that a lot of these bucks will do, and I kind of developed a hunting technique of my own for this in gun season, in this example, is a lot of times if the pond is smaller, when they approach it, they'll be on the downwind side of the pond and scent check and clear the bedding area on the other side. There may be some thermal activity from the water, but it's not going to override an actual wind that is blowing. And so they'll scent check and clear that other side of the small pond, and then they'll actually J-hook around the pond, either on a dam or some other crossing, and get into some really heavy cover on their backside, bed down, and they can watch across the pond. So understanding that sometimes that's what the bucks do around these ponds in gun season, I actually approach on the downwind side with anticipated bedding. across the pond, and I realize that they're going to be watching over in my direction. And so I get as close as I can. I'll have a couple of sticks in the stand, and I'll get just up off the ground so I can see out across the pond. And I've shot bucks on the other side of the pond when they've stood up in their bed. I've shot bucks when they moved 20 feet away from their bed. And I've shot bucks that come down to the edge of the water to stage. A lot of times a buck will get up, he'll come down to the edge of the water. He may drink, he may not. And he'll just stand there and look, listen, and smell for several minutes while he tries to acclimate to his surroundings now that he's up and out of his bed. Now with bow hunting, you have to, you can't shoot all the way across the pond with your arrow, so you've actually got to get over into that J hook area where he crossed over to the other side and set up and tried to take him there. Now, bucks don't always set up that way. I found bucks that set up on the downwind edge of the pond even, but again, there's a reason that they do that. It's because the other side isn't conducive for them to be. And I've even found bucks bedded crosswind to the pond, adjacent to the pond. So I think the takeaway from that is that there's generalities around these beaver ponds, but they're really great places to hunt because in a big woods environment where you don't have agriculture, these beaver ponds have everything that a buck needs. Because the sunlight is penetrating the edge of the water, it's really thick and it provides a lot of food. Early season, they're eating leaves, and then after leaf drop, they're browsing on the brush along these ponds. So it has food, water, cover, and does. And so everything that a buck needs to have in his life can be contained in these little microenvironments of a beaver pond back in these cedar swamps. And so if I can spot a beaver pond in any big woods environment, not just cedar swamps, that's why I make a beeline to it. I'm almost always going to find a potential target buck in those areas. Not always, but most of the time.
And so as we come through this hunt, for guys that are new to this or that want to venture in there, and so they've located an area, they've went in there and did some scouting, whether it's in the summer or preseason or even during the season, they've gotten in there, they've done their hunt, they're successful or they're not. Now it's dark. Okay.
Right.
So,
and people are very fearful of that. I get it. Yep.
And so, I think that's one thing that it's always lost on the scouting, no matter where it is you're in there under ideal conditions when it's convenient for you. You can see, you can walk, you can all this stuff, and then at the end of the hunt, you now have to navigate however long. Let's say you're not concerned about your wind current or anything like that off of this island, and it's a 45-minute walk out. Tips for navigating, staying calm, understanding for maybe that first time. You listen to guys like Dan talk about the guys that are afraid of the dark and they leave 20 minutes before it gets dark when they're not that far back, and so now you're a long ways away. So how do you point people in that direction?
Well, when you're hunting these big cedar swamps, if you're hunting it alone, someone really does need to know where you are. At least have a general idea, of where you're going to park and head into the swamp, kind of a thing, so that if something did happen, people have a place to begin to look. But if you're careful and you mark a trail, whether that's with ribbon or reflective tacks or whatever makes you comfortable. If you're not really comfortable with remembering the terrain and compass navigation, or most guys now are following plot trails on their GPS, and that's fine. They'll get you pretty close, but you have to be careful in cedar swamps, because if you're off by a little ways and you have no visibility, it's not like hunting in any other environment. You don't want to have to swim across a quarter-mile wide beaver pond. You better be able to hit that mark where you're going to cut across that dam or go do an end around. So, I think for guys that are just getting into it, a really great place to hunt is the edge of the cedar swamp. You're going to find a lot of buck sign out in that area, and if they're not too heavily pressured, they'll be right along the edges. Great place to find scrapes along the edge of a cedar swamp during the rut phases, and it's great places to hunt. When you get a little more advanced with your scouting, one of the biggest things I would recommend to people who want to hunt a cedar swamp is, as soon as the season's over, get back in there in the daylight where it's easy to get in and out and start scouting those areas out. And you're going to see all the buck rubs and the tracks and the droppings and start to formulate a plan for the following year. If you have the time to do it, that's the optimal time to get into these swamps and find where all the deer were, where they were bedding, where they were traveling, where the rut sign is. Really a key time. So if you don't have a lot of experience with cedar swamps and you're going to do it this fall and you've never been in there, I would focus on the edges of the swamp. There's some great buck bedding and buck travel right on the outside edge of it. And you could also do some what I call driveway hunting. A lot of times, if you're able to detect on an aerial that there's a little micro island just inside the edge a ways, a lot of times the bucks will bed down, surround themselves with water and thick cover for protection, and then have a short driveway exit where they're going to come out to the edge of the swamp. And so for a beginner or someone that's going to try it for the first time that hasn't had time to scout, that's probably the best way to start off. Just don't go blundering, a mile back into cedar swamp and then hoping that you're going to be able to make it out, even with just your GPS. You got to be a little more careful than that, if that makes sense.
Sure. And then that driveway hunting that you're talking about kind of gets me into one of the other questions that I wanted to touch on. Everybody wants to get trail cam pictures. And, a lot of people want to put them where they hunt or where they're expecting to hunt so that they can go in there and check the camera and say, yes, this deer was here during the daylight where I'm going to be hunting. A lot of times, I'd say 99% of the time, with the exception of cellular cameras and stuff like that, that's probably the last thing you want to do because you have to go in and check them and it changes everything,
Right.
100%. In this case, with the cedar swamp being almost, impenetrable to do on a regular basis, to check that camera, to the amount of work and maintenance that it would take to do that. How are you using trail cameras in these cedar swamps, to locate and pattern these bucks?
Well, I'm using them to find a buck that I want to hunt in an area, but typically it's in the outer transition areas. I'm not going to put that camera right at the buck's bedding area. I'll get one picture and then I won't see the buck again as soon as he picks up my scent. I'm talking about an older buck. Sometimes younger bucks do some foolish things. Sometimes the 2.5-year-olds will, repeat visit a trail camera in these swamps. But when I don't have a lot of trail cameras, but when I do put them out, I've identified buck travel corridors, not just for bedding, but also for the rut. And I can get an amazing number of buck pictures on some of these trail cameras, but it's all about knowing where to place them, where these buck transition areas are in and out of bedding. I think everybody thinks that the same buck always beds in the same spot all the time. That's seldom the case. Depending on wind direction and time of the year. For example, an island in the cedar swamp may have 3, 4, 5, half a dozen different bucks at different times of the year that bed on that island. Other times there's does bedding in the exact same spot. So when I use the trail camera, I'm paying a lot of attention to the date, the wind, and the conditions of that day to set up and hunt that buck. But it also gives me information on future hunts in future years that's probably going to be duplicated when the wind's blowing that same direction in that same area with similar conditions. So that's kind of how I use the trail cameras. I rely on real woods sign even more than trail cameras because I don't have enough of them. And what I like to do is I'll go to a small funnel that's close to buck bedding, but not so close that it's going to disrupt the buck bedding there or other bucks. And I'll move in on these little funnels. Maybe it's a creek crossing or a terrain transition or a change in vegetation and tree type. And I can actually see a rub or a set of tracks or a scrape. It's what I call singular sign. And when I find this singular sign, if it's fresh, then I act on it. Same thing with the trail cam. If it's a fresh pick and I can relate it to that buck bedding area where I suspect or already know that buck's bed, that's when I'm going to move in on them.
So you're taking that picture regardless of the time of day that it was taken and saying the wind was this, the date was this, the travel direction was this, and then backtracking that timeline. So if it's right at dusk, he wasn't very far away. If it's 2 a.m, you might have to look back a little farther, and you're using your information that you've gathered in the woods or why you placed that trail camera there, your knowledge of the area to figure out where to hunt.
Exactly.
Okay. So I think that's one of the things that gets overlooked to some degree. I think everybody wants to put a trail camera where they know that they're going to get pictures.
Yeah.
And then that they can hunt nearby there, rather than just saying, okay, I just want to know what's in the area so I can go to the spot that I know of.
Right. And when you mentioned that trail camera pick at 2 a.m. in the morning, a lot of people don't understand what a buck's capability is, especially during the rut periods. If you're talking a 3, 4, or 5-year-old buck, it may have been quite a job for you to get back there, but that's nothing to a buck. A lot of times they'll come out of these cedar swamps and travel 2, 3, 4, 5 miles in a night, come back in an oval pattern, swing back around, and come into that bedding. So when you're seeing a picture at 2 a.m. in the morning, that buck may have came from a long ways away. And that's a good point that you made there. So, never forget that a mile of cedar swamp to a mature buck is nothing, whereas it's a real job for us. They can get in and out of that mile pretty quickly. They don't even slow down. It's not a big deal to them.
I guess one question on that note, when you talk about the amount of area that they cover and the amount of travel and the amount of bucks that may be using a singular bed or a bedding area, have you over the years picked up any patterns like that are repeatable, not just for one deer, but kind of like across the board?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Probably the finest example I've got of that is one of my father's deep cedar swamp stands. As you know, the gun deer season always opens up here in Michigan on November 15th. And when he would penetrate to that stand, it was in between a couple of big beaver ponds that had doe bedding areas on some islands around them. The bucks would transition between those doe bedding areas. But he, for 14 years in a row, shot a buck on November 16th between 9 and noon. And so a lot of what we had going on there was some of the bucks that live on the periphery of the swamp and outside of it that knew the swamp was there. After the giant influx of hunters on opening day, they were making it back into the interior of this big cedar swamp where they couldn't be disturbed and would carry on with rut activity and never come across human scent. Now, 14 years in a row is far too much to be a coincidence. And it was always on November 16th, the second day of the gun deer season. So, that's a huge pattern that he was able to take advantage of. We used to joke around with him and kid him and say, okay, it's November 16th. We'll be listening for that 7 meg between 9 and noon. And, 10:30, we'd hear the 7 meg go off, a mile away. So absolutely, there's exploitable patterns of when the bucks are going to show up. And another thing that I point out real quick is these swamps have what I call local bucks and transient bucks. So the local bucks live there in and around and just outside of these swamps most of their lives. During the rut periods and when the leaves come off the trees and they lose their cover, and then when the winters kick in, we have a lot of transient bucks that move into these swamps from other areas that don't spend a lot of time there. Now, I was chasing a transient around 2 falls ago that didn't show up in the cedar swamp I was monitoring until about the second week of December. And he showed up, and he was just an absolute monster. Unfortunately, I never got close enough to get a shot at him. But I'm pretty convinced that he'd never been in this cedar swamp up until that time frame. So there are definitely patterns that can be exploited, and it really depends on if you're hunting local bucks that are there most of the year, or if you're hunting these transient bucks that all of a sudden, for the first time in a calendar year, the buck bedding area becomes active. Got some big tracks and maybe a fresh rub 100 yards away from it, that sort of a thing.
And so that the spot that you're talking about, that's the November 16th spot, is that a bedding area? Is it a transition area? Or, what makes it so consistent?
Well, it had doe bedding, for one thing. It was in between a couple of other doe bedding areas that were on some beaver ponds, and it was actually a cedar island surrounded by cedars that were underwater, flooded, if you will. And so you had about 3 different doe families that these bucks could move in on there. But a lot of them didn't get that far back into the interior of the swamp until all that pressure started pushing them back there. And so that November 16th became quite an important day for that deep interior blind. Wherever the bucks had been, they had moved away from it because of all the human activity and guns and scent, and ended up back there.
Well, it's interesting to me to think about that scenario there, because with it being on November 16th, the opener's always on the 15th. It's
right.
Not always on the first Saturday in November or so that same date was then on every day of the week, 2 times
yep.
through. So it didn't matter if the opener was on a Saturday where you would think that you'd have more hunters or whatever. So that kind of lends to the amount of pressure that there actually is, around that area.
Particular area, yep. That area there, that swamp, when you step out of it, there's hunters all over the place. Some of them will go 100 yards into it. But if you penetrate 200 yards into it, those bucks don't have any human scent back there, and they carry on with their regular activity. But yeah, that was all hunting pressure based, and that's the reason that they were there. In that particular area on November 15th, after the day's hunt was over, we'd grab a quick bite to eat, and then we'd do a drive around that huge cedar swamp on a road, and we'd see some bucks that were vacating other areas head back into that swamp. We almost never saw a buck going out of the swamp. They were all going into it because of all of that hunting pressure.
So if you had, one thing to say to new hunters or guys that have been dabbling in these swamps and things like that would maybe help them, the one tip that you think is made manageable, successful, whatever, that's kind of turned the corner, one thing that you would say would help them more than anything else, what would you say to that guy?
Well, I'd say don't get too carried away at the start. Get on the edges. Get on the edge of the swamp. Find those scrape lines, those rub lines, those bedding areas that are on the outer edge, and work your way in. And in fact, there's great buck hunting right on the edges of these swamps, and you don't have to get too carried away. So I think the best recommendation I could give to someone that's new to it is start on the outside, and if you want to work your way in later, then go ahead and do it. But there's plenty of great hunting right on the outside edges of these cedar swamps. And if those bucks don't get pressured too much, that's where they're going to be.
And that just brought up another thing that I wanted to ask you. You're going in so far. You're going into this somewhat unforgiving terrain. For all intents and purposes, are these hunts like one and done? Where there's a lot of bed hunting where you kind of got to kill them on the first shot unless you're doing an observation or something like that. Are you continuing to hunt the same areas, the same spots, as long as it's a good wind and things like that? Or are these kind of like one and done and you're kind of staggering where you're hunting?
They're not one and done, but they're certainly not one in many days either. A lot of times, if the conditions are right, like you mentioned, with the right wind, and I'm pretty sure that I haven't been detected, I'll hunt that spot 2 days in a row. Once in a great while, if I had a near miss on day 2 and I think I'm still in the game, I might hit it a third time. But I've shot a lot of bucks the second time that I've hunted a stand, so it's a little bit different from a lot of the other environments that we hunt. If you hunt it once and are fairly confident that you haven't been detected, some of the deer populations are so low in some of these cedar swamps, depending on where you are, that I'll definitely give it a go if the conditions are right for more than one day.
Okay, because one, you mentioned your grandfather stand there that was successful on the second day,
Yep.
X amount of years in a row. He's not shooting those bucks on day 1. So I know from my experience that doing that both mentally and physically is a lot of work. And say on a week-long hunt or something like that, it can get discouraging real fast.
Right.
So,
yeah. Well, you need to have more than one spot to hunt, but a couple of days in some of these real remote areas shouldn't have too much of an impact. A lot of times I'll shoot the buck the first day that I sit there, and so it makes sense that you wouldn't want to hunt too much after that first day. But if the conditions are right, I'll definitely hunt the stand more than once. Now, I'm not going to hunt it 3, 4, or 5 days. I mean, that's not going to be conducive to getting a nice buck in most of the places that I hunt. But I'll definitely hunt it a couple of days for sure.
Okay. And then finally, being having a history of as a first responder and helping guys out of these swamps,
Yep.
do you have advice for people who find themselves in a situation where they are lost or are not confident in where they're at, and they're starting to have that breakdown moment where, okay, what do I do now? The panic that sets in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, don't go charging all over the place, and that's unfortunately what a lot of these guys that get lost do. They panic, and they start charging in a direction that they think is a good way to go to possibly get out, when in fact they may just be getting themselves in further and further. If you're not going to make it out and you're a long ways in there, just try to set up to survive the night. It's not a bad idea to have something to start a little far with if you can, but otherwise try to get as dry as you can, get some shelter set up, something to bust the wind to protect you a little bit, and ride it out until the next morning. A lot of times when that sun comes up, if it's not real cloudy, you can get a direction. The sun's starting to get daylight in the east, and you know that you came in from the north. You can use that, but it's so thick in the canopy. Sometimes that's not going to help a lot. But try to stay warm. Don't go charging around, getting yourself lost worse than you already are. And people are going to come looking for you, and it's even as dense as these cedar swamps are. It's surprising how far a voice will travel. I've been going back in a mile or so to hunt and heard someone yelling help. And they've crossed miles during the night coming in from the other side in a panic. And when I actually got to where I could see them and I called out, they always run at me with this crazy look on their face. I have to calm them down a little bit and tell them that I'm going to take them out and that sort of a thing. So, if it's going to get dark and it's obvious to you that you're not going to make it out, try to set up a little bit of shelter for yourself to get through the night and take it back up in the morning and know that people are going to be looking for you.
Okay, yeah, I think that's great information. Like I had mentioned to you before, our property is to the north is a giant swamp, and from the first time I ever set foot on the property, I had a compass in my hand, and they said, if you get lost, go south. There's a road that's to the south. To the north is a bad idea. So It's like I've been there, and I remember being 12 years old and getting twisted up, and I was just on our property and just 50 yards from the road, but it was that panicked feeling, and so you have to stop and think and then say, okay, well, if I just head south, and then
right.
Inevitably you'll find something that, at least for me, that I recognize. And so that was the thing. But in the evenings, when it gets dark, there is no ambient light. There's not a barn light. There's not
That's exactly
a road,
right.
A radio
There's no
tower.
farmer's light. There's no anything like that. And if you're in a mature stand of cedars, you might have a little 3-foot hole very up, way up at the top of the trees where you can see a star or something. So it can be pretty intimidating, for sure. One of the things that I did when I was younger, and even now it's not a bad idea, I always found that if I actually had a topo map with me of my hunting area, that covered miles, that always was kind of like a security blanket for me before I got really experienced at spending a lot of time. And so I would encourage that to someone that wants to go into one of these big swamps, is to have that map. It kind of gives you a sense of knowing where you are in your direction, rather than just walking around blindly. And again, when you've got your GPS, batteries fail and they wear out, and if you fall into the water and all that sort of a thing, they can really fail. So I always kept, a topo map in a sealed Ziploc bag in my pocket or in a pack, and with a couple of compasses. You can't get into too much trouble. It might take you, if you get a little lost, you get a little wayward and out of your way, it might take you a lot longer to get out than normal. But like you said, if you've got that map and you've got those compasses, and you've got any kind of a light source at all, you are going to be able to move in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's all great information. It's hard to, I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this, because unless you have someone, like you had in your life, growing up, that's just always been through it, and you were able to kind of do I don't know, the beginner's guide to cedar swamps, because your family took you on how they did it, and then you got
Right.
to do it, with a buddy, with your dad, with, then on your own, but you were still using the same area. and then picking up that information and then applying it elsewhere. For most guys, they either grew up hunting field edges and small stands of timber, or have only lived in an era of GPS and Onyx, and they think, well, I'm just going to bust through here and I'm going to have cell phone service and everything's going to be fine. And that's definitely not the case when you get into those areas. So to have you kind of talk through your experiences both on the hunting side of it, but the navigating, what to look for in the terrain and everything, I think is really helpful to a lot of people. So I do really appreciate you coming on and talking to me tonight.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's kind of all we have for this evening. One of the things that we always ask is, what is your bow setup and your bow hunting equipment?
Yeah, it's actually pretty simple compared to what most guys have got out there. My bows, sometimes I'll just have a single pin, or I'll use an eradicator sight that's got the radioactive glowing dots on it, just a single sight and that sort of a thing. But I've always, I started off always being sighted in at 20 yards and then making an adjustment with that single pin. So I'm not one of the guys that's out there shooting 80 yards or anything like that. I'm a kind of a 40-yard or less guy. When you're hunting big cedar swamps, you're not going to get a 40-yard shot anyway. So it works out pretty good for me. Pretty simple setup, nothing too fancy.
And what bow are you shooting?
Well, I've got one that's not being made anymore that was made in Wisconsin. And then the other one and I still have a Matthews MQ-32.
Okay. Yeah, it's always interesting. John, who's still on his anniversary vacation here, is a bow guy, and he breaks them down and tears them apart, rebuilds them, and builds his own strings, and has a target bow, and shoots out to 100, and is really, really into the archery side of it. And it's always interesting to talk to people and their, I guess, the differences in like the ideologies of equipment versus woodsmanship versus the priority is deer versus all I need to do is shoot them at 20 yards, so this equipment is going to do it, and the time spent on different things. So that's kind of why we do it, and just to kind of, like I say, for everybody listening, it's always interesting to see the differences. Now, we've yet to run into anybody that's shooting still the old aluminum arrows, but we have had some thunderheads on here. So
yeah. Well, when I first started off, I had the Bear Grizzly 45-pound recurve, no bow sight, shooting with finger gloves, and I killed a lot of deer that way. So I'm somewhat of a dinosaur, I guess.
Well, I mean, that's, Frank, my father-in-law and his buddy, they were of the same era of, my father-in-law is left-handed. He was shooting a right-handed recurve left-handed because, a long time ago, they didn't make a lot of left-handed stuff. And, his buddy killed his first deer and with 3 arrows in his back pocket standing on a tree limb. And that's, we're not that far removed from that, but it's just the same thing with social media and Onyx and and everything. Technology now moves so fast and information is disseminated so quickly that the equipment changes just as fast, and I think people get lost in this new equipment must be better, and it's going to help me kill deer because social media said so, and that's not necessarily the case.
Very true.
So, yeah, I think that's all I got for you tonight, Scott. Like I said, one more time, just thank you for coming on here and talking with me and kind of spreading the information that you've got, because I think it's very helpful.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Just one final note on cedar swamps, and why they're such high value is it's really the only environment that we have in our hunting where there's always bucks dying of old age if the swamp is of any size. So if you've got a cedar swamp with any size to it, there are going to be bucks dying of old age there. That's certainly not true in almost every other environment that we hunt. So I thought I would add that, and thank you.
Oh, no problem. It's our pleasure. So thank you.
Shut up and sit down.